So let's just quickly recap because we're going to be continuing a little bit on this. Two things we're going to do today is continue more on the idea of Navi and Roa, different kufot, right? Kufas HaShoft and Kufas HaNeviim, which Reb Yaakov learned this idea right into the pasuk Kilai Navi Hayom Yikor Lefanim HaRoa. In other words, the problem was, how could it be that Shmuel died before Shaul? That means, and Shaul, according to Chazal, was only king for 2 years. How could it be that Shmuel is writing a footnote when Shaul comes to Shmuel with his lad, and he says he asks people, where is the house of the Roeh, right? And they have to explain, like in a footnote, it's only a year and a half. That's the Radak's question, and that's what Rabbi Yaakov said. He didn't understand the Radak's answer so well, but we're going to get into the Abarbanel's answer in a week from now. The reason why I'm going to get into it is because Reb Yaakov goes off on a tangent. Balpeh. What I gave you till now is what Reb Yaakov wrote. Today we're going to go into more Balpeh. Then next week we'll go into how he looks at the Abarbanel, what he says. The Abarbanel says a chiddush, but we won't go into it right now. But the point over here is that Reb Yaakov is saying is that it's not that Shmuel Hanavi is telling the people that when Shaul met me, I was still a roeh, and after I anointed him, I became a navi. Meaning, the roeh was a sort of a private citizen that you came to find out about yourself. If you needed, some help with your donkeys. Or the Gromi Vilna says if you needed to know what your tafkid is, and Sefer Mishlei says that, you went to the Navi. That's what he says. But once there was a king, so what the shofet, as being the leader of the Jewish people, the political leader, plus the Moser HaTorah, right? The Kibbul HaTorah, Moser HaTorah, that split up. And Rabbi Yaakov even tries to understand why it's split up. He says in a few places, because the king cannot, king gives over the kingship to his son, and sometimes the son is not cracked up to what he's supposed to be, and therefore he can't take the Masorah, whereas the Masorah to Nevi'im went from Navi to Navi. Usually, if you achieved Nevuah, especially according to the Rambam, you had to achieve being a great Talmud Chacham as well. And therefore, the Navi had nothing to do with his son being a Navi. Many times the sons were not Naviim. In case of Shmuel, his kids were not. The kids were not what their father was, and therefore it didn't go over to them. It went over to the next person, like Nasan Hanavi or Gad Achose, right? So that's where Reb Yaakov's chiddush is over here, and it could be that in Sefer Rus, it also means in Kufa. Even though Sefer Rus was written by Shmuel, right, and that was probably 100 years after Sefer Rus happened, after Boaz and Ruth and Nomi, that story happened. But it could be Lefanim B'Yisrael ala Geula v'ala Tmur l'Kayim Kol Davar Sholaf Ishas Nalo v'Natav l'Re'eu is also in the new Kufa. For some reason, they stopped taking off their sandals and giving to their friend. We don't know exactly why, but the Navi had to explain that in the old Kufa, it was like this. You could learn just simply, it's not talking about the Kufa, but once Sefer Shmuel is referring to Kufa, so you should really say Sefer Rus, which was also written by Shmuel, is also referring to Kufa, right? So it's in the old Kufa, they did it this way. In the new Kufa, they did it that way. And Reb Yaakov would really have to explain, which he doesn't, is what changed as far as Chlipin, the Kenyan Chlipin, from the new Kufa, from the old Kufa to the new Kufa. But we'll get more into Sefer Ruth probably today also as well, at a different angle. But I want to do a piece of the Hesped that Reb Yaakov said on Reb Yecheskel Abramsky, which is in a footnote. Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky recorded the Jewish Observer, which was translated into Hebrew by a kollel in Netanya. Okay, Rav Levine's kollel in Netanya. This goes back many years, but the Jewish Observer, which was the Aguda magazine that came out, it hasn't been around for years already. It seems superfluous today, because they have all their, Hamodiyas in English and this in English and that. But they used to write over Hespedim, lectures that they gave on the weekend, Aguda weekend, the what do you call it, when they had the Aguda convention. Usually it was during the
Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving weekend, correct. So the different people used to speak, and they used to write it over. They had excellent people writing it over. And you'll see what we read today was written over, even though it was written over by probably someone in a kollel, his Hebrew is modern Hebrew. Okay, I'm not so used to that type of Hebrew, but it's excellent. It's very good Hebrew, very clear. I just want to say that the part of that Reb Yaakov relates to Rav Abramsky, Zichrono Livracha, is not here. Okay, that you might need me for, but you're going to get the idea what Reb Yaakov held about Rav Abramsky from the Hesped. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole Hesped because a lot of the Hesped is, the first part of Hesped is what we learned already, right? Reb Yaakov said over his idea, but then he broadens it. And I have to tell you something about Reb Yaakov. And I had one very big Talmud Chacham that got angry at me for saying this, but I know it's true. Reb Yaakov broadened things when he spoke publicly. When he wrote his chidushim, he wrote it very short. He wrote the problem with lanovi ayom karel lefanim aroa, and in the next page he writes down what he thinks the answer is. And I remember him telling me, taking out his notebook and saying, "I finally got an answer to this question," and he was so happy and everything about it. Now, when he spoke about Rav Abramsky, who was a Gadol Gedolim, his most famous sefer is Chazon Yecheskel on the whole Tosefta. Literally, I think it's like 15 volumes on the Tosefta, which is the whole story why he decided to work on it himself. And he felt that because of his work on the Tosefta, he was saved from being killed in Europe. That was the schus, that he was working on the sefer in Europe, and he continued working in Eretz Yisrael. He lived in Bayit Fagan, for those who want to know the neighborhood. And he was a very, very well-known Rav in Europe. He was only 5 years older than Reb Yaakov. I'm not exactly sure Reb Yaakov knew him because he went from Europe to England to Israel, and Reb Yaakov went from Europe to America, to Canada, and then America. So I don't know if they overlapped in Europe in the sense of, I know he was a Rav in Europe when Reb Yaakov was a Rav. He was a Rav in bigger cities, and Reb Yaakov was a Rav in a klein shtetl, a little town. But it could be they knew each other from then. But he was known as a very, very great lamdan, Rav Abramsky. And also, he's not so well known because politically he didn't get involved in anything. So he wasn't a Hollywood star. He didn't get into the Yated every week. If made a bris for a grandchild, they had 12 pictures of him. He didn't get into the Yated. He didn't get into Hamodia. He never went to the conventions. More. I think he was on the Metzes Gedolei Torah, but he was very not judgmental, which of course the Aguda and Degel Torah doesn't love when you're not judgmental. So he didn't make it in that sense. But the Gedolim, he's one of the Gedolim that all the Gedolim knew how great he was. The Ketanim didn't know, but the Gedolim actually did know. So Reb Yaakov was masked him in New York, right? And we're going to go through that particular hesped, right? He did say Shurim in Bayit Fagan. Anyone who asked him to say a shir, he said a shir, like Rav Zalman Nechemia Goldberg asked him to come to this yeshiva, Hesed yeshiva, and this yeshiva. He went and said hesped. In fact, Reb Kamenetsky used to tell a story. So from Reb Kamenetsky, my uncle used to tell that when Reb Chatzkel Abramsky used to pass by a yeshiva, he would go in, and when he'd see the guys learning, he would ask someone to bang on the shulchan. He wants to say a shir on what they're learning on the spot. He would say a shir on what they're learning. Reb Zalman Nechemia was also able to do that on the spot, say a shir. So one time he walked past the yeshiva and he asked his wife if they can go in together, and she said sure. And he goes in, and then she sees he's going up to the Amud with a stender to start saying a shir, and the Bacharim knew who he was, right? I think it was in Geula, and his wife called out to him and said, Yecheskel, you're an older person, you're not so well, why all of a sudden nobody invited you to say a shir? So he said, when you have a drunk and he walks past a bar, he can't hold himself back from going in. He says, when I pass a yeshiva, I can't hold myself from going in and taking a drink. For me, the drink is saying the shir. And he said the shir. Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky told it over to my father, the story. Anyway, that's Rabbi Yitzchak Shurin. He was a gadol shebagdolim. And Reb Yaakov said this hesped. And I'll tell you what the hesped really, I'll give you the bottom line of the hesped. The bottom line, the reason why Reb Yaakov spoke about this whole piece of Torah, okay, was because he felt that Reb Chatzkel Abramsky, more than any other Rav, represented the old Kufa of Europe and the new Kufa of Eretz Yisrael. Old Kufa of Europe, new Kufa of the United States, meaning how Torah went from one place to the other. Reb Chatzkel was the bridge. And that's how he got into this piece, because as we learned, Shmuel was the bridge between two Kufot. He was a shofet, and then he became a Navi. He changed hats in the middle of his life, basically. And it's quite clear from the text of Tanach like that. That's pshat. It's not a drash, right? It calls Shmuel, Vayishpar Yisrael Kol Yemei Chayav. And then he also know, Ki Lanove Hayom Yikor L'Fin Maroa. He was also in the new Kufa as well. I just want to say parenthetically, okay, Rabbi Yaakov, I mentioned to you, when he spoke, he broadened things, right? And I told somebody, when he learned without giving shiurim, he wasn't so much machadish, right? He used to learn. He used to go over, his daily thing was going over 2 chapters of Tanach, the Daf Hayomi, and Shnayim Mikveh Targum, okay, Mishnayos, Tor Shulchan Aruch, and the regular Shulchan Aruch, right? And in Orach Chaim, he did the Mishnah Berurah as well. Okay, that's what Reb Yaakov's day was. Now he did it very fast. Okay, what I just mentioned to you might take people 5 or 6 hours to do. He did it probably in an hour to 2. Okay, because he didn't have the time. Probably 2 hours throughout the day. He was able to do that. But a lot of times he wasn't machadish. He just read through the Gemara. He wanted to remember the Gemara, right, and go over it with the Rashi, some Tosfos, and then he went to the Mishnayos, went over Mishnayos, and once in a while, if he did see a Chiddush, right, he if he had a chance, he wrote it down. Sometimes he didn't have a chance to write it down, but sometimes he did. But when he spoke publicly, he was always machadish. Now, I'm choshed that a lot of it, not just some of it, a lot of the chidushim he said publicly were on the spot. When he was forced to say something new, he did. Otherwise, he used to say to me, otherwise I learn erlich. What does it mean, erlich? I learned like what you have to know. I go through what you have to know, and I don't sit and think about, I have to say a chiddush, right? That's why on the Nevi'im Rishonim, Reb Yaakov Sefer is very thick. On the Nevi'im Achronim, it's not very thick, not because he didn't learn Nevi'im Achronim. He finished Tanach every 2 years. He finished the whole Nevi'im and Ksuvim. So he had a Seder, even Iyun, in Nach as well. Okay, so he had plenty of time to go through the Tanakh and the Chumash and Tanakh and be machadish. But he a lot of times only did that when he was going to speak publicly on the parsha, or publicly gave a shir on the Nevi'im Rishonim. But he never gave a shir on the Nevi'im Achronim. Why not? Because they never asked him. People asked him to give Tanakh, the Nevi'im Rishonim. When it got to the Via Machron, they told him to give a share on the Ramban instead. So he told whatever they wanted. He gave the share. But I always said to him, Zaidi, now you don't have your Fidusha on your Mio, your Shai, your Cheskel, right? Because it is. So he says, yeah, I know. They should have told me to give on Tanach, but they didn't. They told me to start the Ramban, so I gave on Chumash Ramban. The point over here is Reb Yaakov was Mechadish when he needed to be, when he was forced. I'll just leave you one story. Okay, I remember the story. Reb Yaakov was in Eretz Yisrael, and Reb Yitzchak Weiss, the head of the Eda Charedis, the Kornel Levracha, the Minchas Yitzchak, came to see Reb Yaakov by my uncle's house, Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky, in Kiryat Mattersdorf in Kiryat Yitri. And they were talking, and he said, by the Litvaks, they also have minhagim without any makoros. So Reb Yaakov looked shocked. He said, in Litta, they have a minhag without a makar? He says, of course. They say a hoicha shmanesre. For mincha, they don't go over the whole chazar sashatz in many yeshivas. They just start right away, and the shatz, it starts right away, and he goes till the kedusha. After the kedusha, everybody starts shmanesre. Okay, they do a short. In other words, a short chazar sashatz. By Ramosha Feinstein yeshiva, that's the way they did it. In Chaim Berlin, they did a long one, but Ramosha Feinstein did a short. You guys are familiar with this type of short mincha, right? So he says to Reb Yaakov, there's no makor for such a thing. The going over Shmoneh Esrei is a takana chachamim. It's a takana chacham. They have to go over to Shmoneh Esrei because of the amaratzim, that they don't, to be motzi, the amaratzim who don't know how to daven. So Reb Yaakov on the spot, I found out later, Reb Yaakov, I heard Reb Yaakov say it, but afterwards, Reb Yaakov told me he said it on the spot. What did he say on the spot? He says, what are you talking about? There was never a takana in yeshiva to go over the Shmoneh Esrei. Only in Beit Knesset, not Beis Medrash, because there were no Amaratzim in yeshivas. The Amaratzim were in the Batei Knesset, but not in the Batei Midrashos. So the takana was on the Beis Knesset to do it. On the Beis Medrash, there was no takana, and therefore you could do a short Shmoneh Esrei in the Beis Medrash. So Reb Yaakov told me I said it on the spot, but I think I'm correct. That's what he said. I think I'm right, but he said it on the spot. By the way, Rav Weiss was in shock when he said it. He was taken aback by it. He didn't know how to get out of it. That's what Reb Yaakov said. A lot of times Reb Yaakov did say chidushim on the spot. So I once told this to somebody, a very big Talmud Chacham, because he asked me, why doesn't Reb Yaakov have a lot on Yirmiyahu? So I said, because he didn't say public shurim. He says, what are you talking about? If he was machadish, he was machadish publicly or privately. I said, you're wrong. Privately, he was not machadish, only publicly, which is really very interesting. It's very interesting, who Reb Yaakov was in personality, Anyway, let's go on to the piece now. It's on Shin Samach Aleph, okay, the piece that I want to do. It's a footnote, okay, it's part of the footnote, the long piece. But I only want to start from where we sort of left off in the idea. Et hashinui, you see that? Et hashinui hazeh on page Shin Samach Aleph. Okay? Et hashinui hazeh rav hamashmaut hodienu shmuel be'et shekosav sifra. Lifnim b'Yisrael kol amar ish b'lechti lidrosh elokim l'chu v'nelchad haroa ki lanovi hayom kol l'fanim haroa shini Hashem mora al shini tafkidim. The change shows you there was a change actually in what tafkid Shmuel was filling. Im chilufei hadoras, al chilufei hadoras, on the change of the doros, meaning shoftim neviim. V'yesh be'elu hashlochos al toldos am Yisrael v'shalshelos hakabbalah, and there is ramifications with regard to the it means offspring, but it means what is it? Toldos means the unfolding folding of Am Yisrael, and Shalshalas HaKabbalah is passing of Kabbalah. In other words, this idea has its ramifications in a very big way. It's a change of Shalshalas HaKabbalah from Shofet Vim, and also Toldas Am Yisrael, because it means that there's going to be a change in how the Jewish people are going to be, who's going to be the leader of the Jewish people as far as religion is concerned. Moving Gamadua Bachar Shmuel Anavi, let's say Shinui Alashoni, Toch Kidei Asipra Al Chipus Hasanos. Now we understand why Shmuel decided to tell us this change when Shaul is looking for his donkeys, which is a bit strange. Ki konena et hamalucha b'Yisrael, ki zeh shlav shebo hitcholach atmura, because this is when this change actually took place. Shaul comes to Shmuel about his donkeys as a roer, and then Shaul finds out he's going to be king, and now Shmuel becomes the Navi. Hatzos hanar l'Shaul lifnot el roer haviyatam el Shmuel. The suggestion of the lad to Shaul, his worker, right? To turn to the roer, right, is what changes everything. Hamifgash konenet hamalucha b'Yisrael bo be'eit nitchatma tkufas hashoftim v'niftacha tkufas hanavim, and therefore that's why Shmuel picked over here to tell us this. Whereas could be there were other chapters where someone called Shmuel a roer, but Shmuel doesn't record it. He records it here because it's relevant, because the whole change is taking place here. Efsher Gamsha Pasik Hanal. By the way, this hesped Reb Yaakov gave was probably for an hour. Okay, it was probably a shloshim hesped, because he obviously wasn't at the funeral. He was buried on Har Menuchos, right? Reb Chatzkel Abramsky. So this was probably in America in the shloshim. So he gave a hesped for an hour. Efsher Gamsha Psak Hanal now. A pasuk now, Meshamesh Had. That's a modern Israeli word. Had, I think, means like a response. What does it mean, Wayne?
Echo, an echo.
Head.
Echo,
the word
right?
is head, yeah.
What?
Head.
Echo.
Head, it's called a head?
Yeah.
Right. An echo, or I think it's sometimes an echo liyuzmaso shel Shmuel lachinet ha'am lekras atmura. The echo of the initiative of Shmuel to prepare the nation for this change. Litigamatia hilchatit. I mean, obviously, this is a fellow from the Kollel who knew Hebrew very well. I mean, he knows all the English terms, right?
Wait a second. The language of this footnote is probably edited by Reb Yaakov Kamenetsky, no?
No, it was translated already to Hebrew in Netanya in a Kollel.
And you don't think Reb Yosef edited it himself?
I have to find out if he edited it. Reb Yosef would probably use a different word than legitimatia, right? Because Reb Yosef knows that that's English. The guy in Netanya doesn't know it's English, right?
I did find the Jewish Observer, the English version.
Oh, you did?
They put the link in the chat.
Who found it? You found it?
Yeah, I found it.
Okay,
yeah.
So get a chance, read it over. You'll see. Okay, but so he says, what is he saying here? That the response, right, is that Rav Shmuel wanted to prepare the Jewish people in writing Sefer Shmuel for the new Kufa. B'tzipiyaso et hashini b'talich hanhaga Yisrael, in observing the change in the process of leadership in Israel. Who deal am ki miata yechdal shamesh shofet b'muvan harachav shel misra. He's now stopping to serve as a shofet in the broader way as a job as a shofet. Yeshamish Kanavi achrayal kiyuma v'avarato shel Masorah. He's now going to be only involved with the Masorah. Zeu tzad Mirab Machem Shenokai Kedei Laftiach Ma'avar Chalak V'Holein Bein Dor Echad L'Sheni. This was the first step of many that Shmuel took to make sure that there would be a smooth chalak and holei means an appropriate and smooth transition from one generation to another, right? This is what Shmuel was trying to do. He was trying to prepare the Jewish people for the new world that is going to be a world of a malchus. That is going to include a Navi now being in the Navi is going to be the Masorah now. And this is the way he prepared them by writing what he wrote in the Sefer. There are other things that he also did to do this, and we'll see. I'm going to show you an example. That how did he want to prepare Malchus for the Jewish people? Sefer Megillas Ruth, Ha'okeves, which follows Acher Motzo Shel David HaMelech L'Shalom. The Pashup Pshat is that he wrote Sefer Rus because of the Yichus of David HaMelech. Umochichet Kashrusa L'Malchus. He wants to show you that he's kosher to be a melech, right? That's the whole point of Sefer Rus. There's no question about it. Otherwise, it's like a private little story that happened in the period of the Shoftim. The Zos Mishum Shahu Hirgish Ki Imlo Yaseke Ya'aru Al Tokuf Malchus. Based of it, he was afraid that people are going, and he was right, according to the Gemara. Doeg, in the time of Shaul, questioned whether David can actually be part of the Jewish nation. Certainly, he can't be a king. Zos Yeteremizu, even more so. Shteo episodos, right? That Rabbi Yosef would not write. 2 episodes, right? The guy thinks that's Hebrew, right? Shteo episodos. Hachosmos es Sefer Shoftim, which end, right? Put the Chatima on Sefer Shoftim, as we know, which Shmuel wrote. Shekamor Chubar Alidei Shmuel. It was written from Shmuel wrote it. Hey Moros Tragiyim b'Chayei. There's your Tragiyim. He thinks that's Hebrew, right? The tragic happenings in the Am. Echeru Ma'isen Pesel Micha. Vashenu Ma'isa Pilegish Begiva, right? In other words, Shmuel ends Sefer Shoftim with 2 stories, which we don't even know when it happened, those stories, right? It just says, as Reb Yaakov is going to point out, Harisha niftach b'milim b'yomim ha'imei melech b'Yisrael isha yashar beinav yaseh. V'asheni niftach b'milim v'yehi b'yomim ha'imei melech b'Yisrael. In other words, Shmuel, Reb Yaakov is saying, V'rotzaloma ki b'shelhei kufas ha'shoftim hechel lehistorer anarchia. Anarchia, right? He thinks that that's Hebrew, right? The guy writing this, right? At the end of Kufas HaShoftim, meaning we don't know exactly when these stories were written, but Shmuel is definitely trying to show that anarchy was going on in Sefer Shoftim. People, and we're going to see this, by the way. I'm going to show you. Reb Yaakov was going to learn these 2 stories up like you wouldn't believe. Okay? Al Pi Pshat. He's going to learn them up. That we're going to see in a few weeks from now when he discusses the piece of Torah he said to Rav Soloveitchik in 1937 to get him to open up a yeshiva with him in Boston. Soloveitchik, of course, refused, right? But Reb Yaakov wanted to be the mashgiach, and Rav Soloveitchik would be the Rosh Yeshiva, even though Reb Yaakov was at least 12 or 15 years older than Rav Soloveitchik. He said, I'll be the mashgiach in the yeshiva. But Rav Soloveitchik, said no, and it's different. There's different reasons why he said no. But he told him over the Dvar Torah about difference between a shofet and a melech, a lumdish apiece that he told Rav Soloveitchik, which we'll talk about probably already, maybe even next week.
This was in 1937?
37, I think it was.
In 1937, Rab Soloveitchik had already accepted upon himself the responsibility of YU because his father died by then, hadn't he?
I don't think he died yet. He didn't die till 1942 or 43.
Ah, okay.
So he took over in 1941 at YU.
That's also when he came to Eretz Yisrael.
In 37, right?
Right.
He was the Rav of Boston. He had there was an official rabbi like there used to be in St. Louis, official Rav of Boston, right? And then he opened up a yeshiva in Boston for, my father went there in 1940, for about 15 guys, maybe a little bit less, guys from Europe who only spoke Yiddish. And he opened up like a yeshiva. A few of them were married, most of them were single, and he gave shiurim for them. But he was the Rav in Boston. People used to come to him for shilas in Boston. He was a young man at the time. He was probably in his late 30s at the time, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, maybe even mid-30s at that time. In any event, we'll talk about that this idea between a shofet and a melech, that we'll talk about already next week. And that's when Reb Yaakov is going to go into these two stories more in depth. But but here he says clearly, Ratzaloma, at the end of the Tkufa, he wanted to show that anarchy over here was ruling, right? Because there was no melech. Bekach hechshir Shmuel et hareka lepsichaso shel tkufa hachadasha shel shilton rikuzei v'hadok shel hamelech kimuanak lo al pi dinei hamalchus. In this way, Shmuel prepared the background for the opening of a new tkufa. That's why when he wrote Shoftim, he picked out these two stories to show, without a melech, take a look at the anarchy that becomes in the nation, right? And that's why it starts off a melech b'Yisrael, right? In those two stories. So he was showing Kuf Chadash Shel Shilton, the central, right, the central ruling and type of a king that was granted to him al pi dinei malchus, that he would have taken care of Pilegish Begiva differently. He would have taken care of Pesel Micha differently. Those things would not have happened. Okay. Now he starts going into the personality of Shmuel, which he would never write about in a sefer. Okay, this is already Reb Yaakov, publicly speaking, starting to define the personality of Shmuel. Reb Yaakov didn't write things like this. He didn't write over drushos in his notes. He never wrote over drushos he gave. He only wrote over a vart that he gave, but not a drusha.
Why is this something that he wouldn't write about?
He felt he didn't have the time. I mean,
it's not because the nature of the subject he felt was too controversial.
In other words, a drush, Reb Yaakov held from his drushes, but a drush didn't seem to him as important as to write the vort down, to write the idea down, based on a pasuk or based on a Gemara.
Do you think that the degree of whether something is controversial or not would be a reason that he would or wouldn't write something down?
I'm going to try to show you that would not be true. To the contrary, sometimes you could say the opposite, that publicly he may be a little bit more careful, but when he wrote things down, that was really for him, that he wasn't worried about that so much. I think I could show you cases where he was not worried about this. But I will tell you the truth, Wayne, that even publicly he wasn't worried about it. Reb Yaakov wasn't like different Rabbanim, like Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was a little bit nervous to give you something that he held if he knew it's going to get out. He was nervous about it. I went to him a few times. He was nervous about it. Okay, Reb Yaakov was not nervous, and Ramosha was not.
There were less crazies in America than they are in Eretz Yisrael.
That's probably also true, but Reb Yaakov wasn't afraid like of the Satmar or the Chabadnikim, getting too wild, and the Satmar, when they got angry at someone, they called the fire department on him. They used to call the fire department and say, "There's a fire on this and this street, and this address." And also the fire engines would all come in New York and think there's a fire there, which is a terrible thing if you think about it, because let's say there's a fire somewhere else, right? But I have an uncle who wrote something in the forwards. He was a writer in the forwards, and the Satmar people got angry at him for writing it, and they sent the fire department to him. and in Eretz Yisrael, they do the same type of thing, not with the fire department, but other things. I know that Revice, they got angry at Revice, and they put an ad in the paper to call on Shabbos because he has a washer and dryer he wants to sell. So the phone didn't stop ringing on Shabbos. He wanted to answer it because he thought if they're calling like that, it must be Koch Nefashos, right? I don't remember if he did answer it, and then he saw it was like they wanted to know if he still has his washing machine that he wants to sell, right? This is terrible stuff. Reb Yaakov was not afraid of that, and it never happened with Reb Yaakov. Baruch Hashem. In other words, they didn't start up with Reb Yaakov. I don't know why, but he had Siyata D'Shmaya. Okay. Lemrosha mikotzer hamasig einon musugalim la'arich et shir komaso shel hanovi Shmuel. Even though Reb Yaakov starts off by saying, "Who are we to define the great personality or evaluate the great personality of Shmuel Hanavi?" Hine akosav atzmo maskiru b'neshima achas in Moshe v'Aaron. Moshe v'Aaron b'cho hanavu Shmuel b'korei shemo. Ana v'chaser pniya ishit b'chol hanagel anhogas klal Yisrael. This was a humble person, and he was chaser pniya ishit, meaning he had no self-interest in all that was pertinent to Klal Yisrael. Kachu yochel ledaber al atzmo beguf shlishi b'fenoso el ha'am vayishlach Hashem es Rubal ves Bedon ves Yiftach ves Shmuel. Shmuel's talking here, and he says God sent when you were in trouble. God sent Gidon, Yerubal, Bedon is Shimshon, Yiftach, and Shmuel. He's talking about himself, and he calls himself in third person. Vayatzel eschem b'yaroi vechem misaviv v'teishvu betach. Right? He's mustering out the people for asking for a king. And he says he sent Shmuel, right? As if he's not talking about himself. In other words, Rabbi Yaakov was trying to show Shmuel had no self-interest. When he spoke about himself, it was completely outside. It was as if he was talking about a different person. That's why he doesn't say Ani, he says Shmuel. Okay? Now, Rabbi Yaakov didn't write that on the pasuk. On this pasuk, he doesn't say, you see from here that Shmuel didn't have negias because he spoke about himself in third person, as if it's a different person. You can't find that in Reb Yaakov's Chidushim. That's a vertel, right? On the pasuk. That you'll find in a drasha. Okay? He was completely against, according to Reb Yaakov, he was completely against the new world order of going from a shofet to a melech. Like it says in chapter Yud Beis, right? B'Sefer Shmuel, Aleph, Perik Yud Beis, right? In other words, it says there clearly that Shmuel said that you doing well with me as a shofet, and yet you asked for a king. Mishum sheratza leitevim Yisrael. Why did he give them Musar? Because he meant for Jewish people's benefit. It wasn't that he was worried about his own covet. He meant for the benefit. Why? Because kingship comes with its own problems, as we see with Shaul and David. And then, of course, later on, we see the terrible things that happen with the kingships. Lo manami menu klal avtiach me aver ma'avar chalak v'holein shel hanaga. But the fact that he was against it didn't stop him to ascertain, to be sure that there would be a very
smooth transition.
What?
Smooth transition.
Right. It will be a smooth transition. Shel hanhaga. Gam im hatotzah ita ketz l'hanhagaso shelo. Even though this would end his leadership. Right? What's he trying to show? That Shmuel is preparing the Jewish people for Malchus, even though it's at his own cost. Meaning he writes in Sefer Shoftim, right, that we need a king. And he writes about a new Tkufa, right? And he writes about Ruth, right? The Sefer Ruth, to show that David was could write Lamalchus, right? David HaMelech, right? He's saying all these Shmuel tried to show us, right, the need for kingship, right? He tried to prepare the nation for kingship, even though he was against it, right? And it would end his own malchus, so to speak, his own being a leader of the Jewish people. But yet, this is what God wants. So I'm butler daiti Eitzah Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? Kol ze meir al ma'amado haniskav shel Shmuel Hanavi. This all tells you about the exalted position of Shmuel Hanavi. Now, this is something Reb Yaakov could have written in notes. No notes on it. This he says, and I'm sure as he was talking, he was saying the new things that he was being mechadish as he was talking. There was stuff here he didn't think about before. Lefikach Kodma, by the way, I remember him saying to me a lot of times, when I give a hesped, for the first like 30 seconds or minute, I'm nervous. And then I forget that I'm nervous. I start talking and I tell over a maisa and I forget that I'm nervous. And then I'm not nervous anymore. So a lot of times he starts talking and it just started developing the issue as he was talking. Okay. Now he says, Lefikach Kodma, now he says something very interesting. Kodma Baskol, right? Ubisret Leidaso Hasfuya. Therefore, you know that there's a medrash. Rashi brings it in Sefer Shmuel, right? Rashi brings in Sefer Shmuel a medrash. Let's just see if my Sefer Shmuel is basically falling apart. But in Sefer Shmuel, there is a there's a medrash. I don't know if you've ever heard it before. Medrash says that a baskol came out of Shemayim and announced that there's going to be a child born by the name of Shmuel who's going to lead Klal Yisrael. And that year, everybody named the kid Shmuel, hoping that their male child would be Shmuel. But then as the kid grew up, they saw this is not Shmuel, right? But then, so where do we get it from? It says when Shmuel was born, Elkanah says to Chana says to Elkanah she's not going up to Shiloh until the child is weaned. Okay, so Elkanah says Vayomel Elkanah Isha Asiya Tov Beinayich Shviat Gomle Chose Oso Ad Ach Yokem Hashem Es Dvaro. But God should establish His word. No, I understand that you don't want to go up. Do whatever's good in your eyes. Stay here until the child is 2 when you finish nursing. Ach Yokem Hashem Es Dvaro. God should establish His word. That doesn't. Which word? Where did God talk over here? So Rashi brings up pshat, the word that Eli blessed you. Then he says, "Umedrash Agada, Reb Nechemia b'shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak, b'chol yom v'yom bas kol yotzos u'mufotzetzos ba'olam v'omeres osit tzadik echad la'amodu shmo Shmuel b'chol isha shahaisa yoledes ben haisa kora shmo Shmuel kiven shahayu roan et masav hayomrim ein zeh Shmuel v'kiven shenolad zeh v'ro masav amru doma shezehu." Right? In other words, so Reb Yaakov's question is, why by Shmuel is there a baskol? Right? When Yoshua was born, there was no baskol. When Moshe was born, there was no baskol. Right? When each shofet was born, Ehud, right? Ehud was born, there was no baskol. Why by Shmuel is there a baskol? So Reb Yaakov says, Boso Shana Kol Isha Sheyolda Ben Kora Shem Shmuel B'Tikva Shabano Yeoso Shmuel Vimlo Lefachot Sheyiskeli Korei Ba'oso Shem. At least he'll be called the name of Shmuel. V'hinei Shmuel Hanavi B'Vadei Yamane Kabolet B'Doro Avalo Yedua Lanu Alabas Kol Doma Shechriza Ali Dosul Hatzfuy Shalmane Gador B'Doros Acherim Why is Shmuel? And Reb Yaakov goes on to say, Im nivdok et pa'alav shel Shmuel hanavi nuchal lavchin ki hu gisher ben shtei tkufot. Because he was the bridge, right, between tkufot. Now, Reb Yaakov doesn't explain it here, but he explained it to me. I remember. Reb Yaakov said like this: at the end of the tkufa of Shoftim, there was no nevuah anymore. It says in the text, Ein chazon nifratz, right? Dvar Hashem haya yakar, but by yomim hahem, right? There was no nevuah until Shmuel came along and brought back nevuah. So it's at the end of a tkufa. Sometimes there's such a downer. The tkufa is so yorud that the people are just going to give up about Judaism. So there had to be a baskel to say, don't give up. There's going to be a child who's going to bring in a whole new tkufa that you're not, that wasn't, there was never a shofet like this before. Yiftach b'dor Shmuel b'doro. He was the greatest of shoftim at the end of the tkufa, right? When the things were going so bad in the period of the shoftim and there was no more nevuah, Rabbi Yaakov, this is the way Rabbi Yaakov said it to me. That's why there was a baskel to tell you that we don't have a time in our history where we could be the most dor yarud, and all of a sudden something is going to change, and you're going to have a great Gadol Batorah come, and he's going to fix up the next kufa to be even greater than the last kufa. That's what Reb Yaakov here said to me. That's what it means over here that Yetera Mizot, who asok kachol yichol lavtiach ma'avar takin bein tkufa achat l'shniya, right? And that this was part of it, was saying the bat kol came out because it was the end of a tkufa, right? Other gedolim were in the middle of a tkufa; they didn't need a bat kol. But at the end of a tkufa, sometimes you need a bat kol in order to make sure the Jews are not mityaesh. That's what Rabbi Yaakov basically said here, and that's how we brought it to Rav Abramsky, because he said he was the end of the Tkufas HaRabbanim of Lita, of Europe, actually. He may have said Europe, but he certainly said Lita. He was the end Tkufas HaRabbanim of Lita, which now there's a new Tkufa in Eretz Yisrael in America, but he was the last of the Mohicans as far as that was concerned. Okay, guys? We'll take up the shot on what he's going to give next week. Is a very interesting pshat. In 5 places in Tanach, it says the word Eliyah instead of Eliyahu, right? 5 places. Rashi takes note of it in Sefer Vayikra. And Reb Yaakov is going to try to answer it al pi pshat and not al pi drash. Why there's 5 places that Eliyahu said, not al pi like Maharal, very pshat in the text. He's going to try to answer that. We'll already see next week. Any questions, any points, guys?
But we're not doing any Barbanel next week?
We're not going to get it to this week. We'll get to it next week.
Next week.
Because we have to take questions now, according to the law.
No, you said we're going to talk about Eliyahu next week. I thought we were doing Barbanel next week.
We're going to talk about the Barbanel and Eliyahu as well next week. Bezrat Hashem. Any questions? Any points? You see how Reb Yaakov was marchiv, this whole idea. If I show you his Ksav Yad, which I have, this whole piece was, I think, about a half a page in writing, right? And yet he broadened it to talk about it for an hour. Right?
So this was translated from Yiddish by this Israeli kollel guy.
No, it was translated from Yiddish to English by the American Jewish Observer.
Oh, and then he translated from English. Okay.
Right. I have a strong feeling that the Netanya guy didn't know Yiddish.
Right.
He knew English better than Yiddish, and he translated it into the Hebrew.
Right.
I'll tell you what happened. This fellow, his name was Levine. I forget his first name. He has a kollel, or had a kollel many years ago in Netanya. He used to publish a sefer every year from the kollel guys on a different topic. So he always used to call me to ask me if there's a piece from Reb Yaakov that he could publish. So I told him there's a piece in the Jewish Observer that if he could translate it, he could publish it. It's a very nice piece on Shmuel and Kufos. And he looked at it, and the guy explained it to him in Hebrew. And he said it was a great piece, so he wanted to do it. And don't forget, a hesped on Rev Abramsky is an important thing in Eretz Yisrael. You know, Abramsky was much more well known in Eretz Yisrael than in America. So you grabbed onto it. Every year he used to call me, and every year I would give him a piece, right? You know, that was originally sometimes in English, or I used to give him 5 pieces that were in 5 different places that Reb Yaakov wrote from year 1930 to year 1980, right? Like in 5 different places. He had it here, he had it there, right? And I would give him all 5 pieces. He'd turn it into a shtickle Torah, the guy. But the pieces themselves was sometimes a half a page, nothing more. Half page written. That's about 4 lines printed.
I'm curious about his lashon of Vishamesh Kinavi Hachriya Kiyuma V'Havrata Shel Masora. I never considered that to be the top key to the Navi before. But the top key to the Navi was to let us know what Devar Hashem is. But it sounds like the role of the Navi here is in the passing down of Torah Shebichtav and Torah Shebal Peh.
The role of the Navi was the role of a Navi, a certain Navi, was to pass Torah Shebal Peh. That went from the Shoftim to the Nevi'im. And there was one Navi who usually was the Baal Masorah, who was the Navi Shel HaMelech. And that's what Reb Yaakov's going to talk about at great length next week. The Navi Shel HaMelech. Next week he calls it Navi Ha'am. But to me, he used to call it the Navi HaMelech. There were many Nevi'im that used to give Nevuah to the Jewish people. But there was one that used to give Nevuah, I would say it a little bit different, Nevuah, which was actually a tochacha to the king. The king would hear Nevuah from other people as well. We're going to see, let's say God, HaChoze, gave Nevuah to David HaMelech. But Nasan, right, was the one he had to talk to if he wanted to do anything big in Klal Yisrael. He never spoke to God.
Well, what's the connection between that and being Ma'atika Shmuad, between giving the Masorah?
So Reb Yaakov held that the fellow involved with the Masorah was considered the Gadol Hadar, and for the questions that were very big questions, like the example we'll see next week is David wants to build the Beis HaMikdash. That's a big thing, right? He has to be mityaetz with the Gadol Hadar. He has to hear Das Torah. He wants to make Shlomo. He wants to make Adoniyahu king, right? He has to be mityaetz with Nasan Hanavi. Nasan comes to him and says, "How could you make Adoniyahu without you didn't talk to me? What do you mean I have to talk to you about it? Yeah, this is a big decision, right? It's a very big decision because actually Nasan said Shlomo is going to be the king, so it's a really big decision, right? So these things, the Navi would come to him and say, listen, you didn't talk to me. Or which Shmuel, and because Shmuel wasn't David's Navi, he was Shaul's Navi. He musses him out about Amalek, musses him out that he didn't wait for Shmuel, right? These are mussah that he gets, what he's getting through Nevuah as well, meaning he comes with a Nevuah, but it's a painful Nevuah, right? Same thing with the Nasan, right? These were they had to be the Gedolei Hadar. Who was the Gadol Hadar? The Baal Masorah.
How is that different from the Shofet? Well, I still don't get it. What happened between the Shmuel as a Shofet versus Shmuel as a Navi? What was the different role?
As a Shofet, he was the Baal Masorah, correct? All the Baal Masorah.
That's
right?
the same.
And he was also the leader in battle of the Jewish people. Right? I don't know if he actually fought, but he told the Jewish people to go out to war, right? He davened to Hashem that they should win the war, right? So he represented really both, right? The Manhig HaRuchani and the Manhig HaKlali, right? Which Reb Yaakov is going to talk about what exactly that Manhig HaKlali looked like, different than the Melech. The Shofet was different than the Melech. That's the piece where of Soloveitchik, which we're going to see probably in 2 weeks from now. Okay, so we'll be on next week, Bezrat Hashem.